Deep in the deadly Amazon rainforest, there lies a ghost town with red fire hydrants and an American golf course. This is not an ancient ruin. This is Fordlandia, a project that burned through the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars, built by Henry Ford himself. So, here is the question. Why did the richest man in history try to force a perfect American suburb into the most hostile place on Earth, only to let it be swallowed whole by the jungle? By the mid-1920s, the industrial landscape of the United States had coalesced around a single, dominant coordinate: Detroit, Michigan. At the center of this coordinate stood the River Rouge complex, a sprawling labyrinth of steel, glass, and smoke that functioned less like a factory and more like a sovereign nation. It was here that raw iron ore entered at one end and finished automobiles exited at the other, a seamless transmutation of matter that had never before been achieved at such scale. Presiding over this empire was Henry Ford. To the public, he was the mechanic who had put the world on wheels, the architect of the Model T. But within the walls of his company, and increasingly in his own mind, Ford was a social engineer. The assembly line was not merely a method of production, it was a moral framework. It imposed order upon chaos. It took disjointed parts and unified them into a functioning whole. If this logic could organize steel and rubber, Ford reasoned, it could certainly organize human lives. This belief in the universal application of industrial order was absolute. In Highland Park and Dearborn, Ford had already established a sociological department to monitor his workers. Investigators visited employees' homes to ensure they were living according to specific American standards: sobriety, thrift, cleanliness, and the speaking of English. Employment was contingent upon compliance. In Ford's worldview, a chaotic home led to a chaotic workspace, and inefficiency was a moral failing as much as a mechanical one. However, the complete independence of the Ford Motor Company was threatened by a single, biological variable: Hevea brasiliensis, the rubber tree. While Ford owned the iron mines, the timber forests, the glassworks, and the railroads required to build his cars, he did not own the rubber. In the 1920s, the global rubber supply was not an open market. It was a stranglehold controlled by the British and Dutch colonial empires, specifically through plantations in Southeast Asia, Malaya, Ceylon, and the Dutch East Indies. The vulnerability of American industry was exposed in 1922 with the introduction of the Stevenson Plan. Orchestrated by the British Colonial Office, this policy restricted rubber exports to artificially inflate prices. For a man like Henry Ford, who despised bankers, monopolies, and any form of external dependence, this was intolerable. The price of tires skyrocketed, threatening to destabilize the low-cost model upon which his entire fortune was built. Ford's response was characteristic of his approach to all obstacles. He would bypass the market entirely. He would not negotiate with the British. He would grow his own rubber, and he would do it on a scale that rendered the Asian plantations obsolete. The decision to look toward the Amazon basin was driven by a mix of botanical logic and romantic nostalgia. The Amazon was the native home of the rubber tree, the place where the boom had originally begun before seeds were smuggled to Asia in the late 19th century. To Ford, returning rubber to its source seemed like a correction of a historical error. But the ambition went beyond agriculture. The project was not simply to secure a raw material. If it were, Ford could have invested in existing plantations or worked with established agricultural experts. Instead, he envisioned a transplant of civilization. He intended to take the industrial precision of Dearborn, Michigan, and overlay it onto the Amazon rainforest. He would build a town. It would not be a rough outpost for resource extraction, but a fully functioning Midwestern American community. It would have paved roads, electric lights, schools, hospitals, and, most importantly, the rigid timekeeping and moral discipline of the Ford Motor Company. This dual motivation, economic independence and social engineering, blinded the project's planners to the realities of the environment they were about to enter. The Amazon was viewed not as a complex, hostile ecosystem, but as a vast, underutilized inventory of resources waiting for management. In the boardrooms of Michigan, the jungle was simply another disorganized factory floor. It required a foreman, a schedule, and a system to become productive. The search for land began without the input of botanists or tropical agronomists. Ford relied on trade attachés and his own business instincts. Negotiations opened with the Brazilian government, which was eager to revive the Amazonian economy after the collapse of the earlier rubber boom. They offered a concession of staggering size, nearly 2.5 million acres on the banks of the Tapajós River, a major tributary of the Amazon. The territory was immense, isolated, and largely unmapped. To the men in Detroit, the lines on the map represented ownership and control. They did not represent the topography, the soil composition, or the biological density of the terrain. The deal granted Ford total exemption from export taxes and allowed him to govern the settlement almost as a private state. In exchange, Ford promised to cultivate the land and share a percentage of profits after 12 years. It was a transaction that ignored the fundamental difference between manufacturing and biology. A machine part is identical to the next, predictable and static. A biological organism is variable, reactive, and dependent on its environment. Ford's philosophy, however, did not account for variables he could not control. He believed that the system which produced the Model T was superior to the chaotic growth of a rainforest. He believed that the indigenous worker, accustomed to the rhythms of the river and the season, could be recalibrated to the rhythm of the time clock and the whistle. By 1927, the plans were drawn, the ships were procured, the capital was allocated, the vision was clear, a grid of American order stamped onto the wild green chaos of Brazil. The tragedy of the endeavor was written in its inception. It was not a failure of funding, for Ford had nearly unlimited resources. It was not a failure of intent, for the goal of producing rubber was rational. It was a failure of understanding. The project assumed that the environment was a passive backdrop, a blank canvas upon which the industrial will could be painted. As the first logistical teams prepared to depart for the Southern Hemisphere, they carried with them the blueprints for a modern utopia. They carried prefabricated structures, power generators, and the unshakable confidence of the machine age. They were not going to the Amazon to adapt to it. They were going to conquer it, not with weapons, but with the sheer force of American efficiency. Henry Ford remained in Dearborn. He would never set foot in the jungle. He would monitor the progress through telegrams and reports, viewing the Amazon through the lens of production quotas and construction schedules. The distance allowed the fantasy to remain intact. On paper, the plan was perfect. The inputs were calculated, the labor costs estimated, and the yield predicted. The stage was set for a collision between two irresistible forces: the supreme confidence of 20th century industrial capitalism and the ancient biological complexity of the Amazon rainforest. The land was purchased, the machinery was moving, the obsession had officially begun. The decision to break ground in the Amazon was made in a room nearly 4,000 miles away from the soil itself. In Dearborn, Michigan, the Ford Motor Company operated on the principle of centralized command. Decisions flowed downward from Henry Ford's office, acquiring the weight of scripture as they passed through the layers of management. When the command was issued to secure a location for the rubber plantation, it was executed with the same bureaucratic efficiency used to procure steel or glass, but with a fatal lack of due diligence. The company did not hire a botanist to select the land. It did not consult with tropical agronomists who understood the volatile chemistry of rainforest soil. Instead, the task fell to a diplomatic negotiation between Ford's business representatives and the Brazilian government, mediated by a man named Jorge Dumont Villares. Villares was not an agricultural scientist. He was a civil engineer and a politician with specific holdings in the state of Pará. He presented Ford's envoys with a concession known as Boa Vista on the banks of the Tapajós River. On the maps, unrolled in the clean, well-lit offices of Michigan, the location appeared ideal. It was vast, covering nearly 2.5 million acres. It was accessible by river, theoretically allowing ocean-going vessels to dock and load cargo. Ideally, it promised a direct supply line from the jungle to the Rouge plant. However, the map was an abstraction. It did not show the topography. It did not reveal that the land Villares was steering them toward was hilly, rocky, and utterly unsuited for the mechanized agriculture Ford envisioned. Tractors, the lifeblood of Ford's farming philosophy, require flat horizons. The Tapajós concession was a landscape of ridges and ravines, covered in a dense, tangled canopy that resisted the straight lines of industrial farming. Furthermore, the soil was sandy and acidic, drained of nutrients by millions of years of rainfall, capable of supporting a diverse rainforest but hostile to a monoculture plantation. Blind to these geological realities, the company authorized the transfer. The deal was signed. The land was bought. The location was fixed before a single soil sample had been analyzed in a laboratory. With the site selected, the logistical machine began to turn. The Ford Motor Company purchased two merchant ships, the Lake Ormoc and the Lake Farge, to transport the initial infrastructure. These were not merely cargo ships, they were arcs of civilization. Into their holds, the company packed the components of a complete American town, a diesel power plant, an ice-making machine, a hospital, prefabricated houses, heavy tractors, road scrapers, and crates of food suited for a Midwestern diet, canned peaches, oatmeal, and flour. The expedition was placed under the command of Einar Oxholm, a Danish sea captain who understood navigation but knew nothing of tropical agriculture. His orders were precise and rigid. Sail up the Amazon, turn south into the Tapajos, land at the designated coordinates, and begin clearing the jungle immediately. The journey up the Amazon River served as the first indication of the dislocation between the plan and the planet. The scale of the river dwarfed the ships. The vegetation on the banks was a chaotic wall of green, impenetrable and silent. As the Lake Ormoc turned into the Tapajos, the water changed from the muddy brown of the Amazon to a deep crystalline blue, masking the treachery of the currents beneath. When the ships arrived at the site in 1928, the reality of the perfect location became immediately apparent. The riverbanks were not the gentle slopes depicted in the prospectors' reports. They were steep, eroding cliffs. The water level of the Tapajos fluctuated wildly between the wet and dry seasons, a variance of nearly 40 feet. Captain Oxholm and his advance team faced an immediate crisis. They could not simply dock and unload. The river was too low, and the banks were too high. The heavy equipment, the tractors and bulldozers designed to conquer the land, was trapped in the holds of the ships. For weeks, the operation stalled. The men, dressed in heavy work clothes suitable for Detroit winters, sweltered in the tropical heat. They were forced to build a temporary dock by hand, laboring waist-deep in water that swarmed with stingrays and piranhas. The primary narrative of industrial dominance began to fracture here. The machines, symbols of speed and efficiency, were rendered useless by the simple geometry of the riverbank. On shore, the situation was equally disorienting. The advance team, consisting of engineers, doctors, and accountants sent from the United States, attempted to establish a base of operations. They were men of systems, accustomed to predictability. Here, the environment was fluid. Food spoiled within hours. Leather boots rotted overnight from the humidity. The insects were a constant, maddening presence, carrying malaria and yellow fever. A secondary narrative emerged among the local laborers recruited to assist the Americans. These were caboclos, people of mixed indigenous and European ancestry who had lived in the Amazon for generations. They understood the rhythm of the forest. They knew that the soil was poor and that the only way to farm was to burn the vegetation and plant in the ashes, moving on after a few seasons. They watched as the Americans attempted to impose a permanent grid. The Americans did not burn and move, they cleared and stayed. They demanded that the trees be cut flush with the ground to allow for the passage of tractors. The caboclos worked with machetes and axes, clearing the underbrush while the Americans waited for their heavy machinery to be liberated from the ships. There was a profound disconnect in communication, not just of language, but of logic. The locals worked with the land, the Americans worked against it. The climactic moment of this initial phase occurred when the heavy equipment was finally brought ashore. The first bulldozers fired up, their engines roaring in the silence of the rainforest. They drove into the tree line, blades lowered, intending to scrape the earth clean. But the terrain fought back. The hills, invisible on the maps in Michigan, proved too steep for the tractors. The machines tipped and stalled. The sandy soil, once stripped of its vegetation cover, turned into a fine dust in the sun and a torrential slurry in the rain. The tractors, designed for the flat prairies of the Midwest, churned uselessly in the mud. This was the first physical defeat. The system, the integration of machinery and labor that Ford had perfected, was incompatible with the topography. Yet, the reports sent back to Dearborn were sanitized. The managers on the ground, fearful of admitting failure to Henry Ford, described the progress in optimistic terms. They reported acreage cleared and buildings erected, omitting the broken axles and the eroding hillsides. The discrepancy between the map and the territory widened. In Michigan, Ford envisioned a flat, green geometric paradise emerging from the wilderness. In Brazil, his men were engaged in a muddy, chaotic war of attrition against geology itself. The foundation of Fordlandia was being laid not on bedrock, but on a fundamental error of geography, compounded by the silence of men who were too afraid to tell the truth. By late 1928, the tentative exploration of the Tapajos River had ended. The phase of negotiation and survey was replaced by a campaign of eradication. To build the ideal American town, the existing biological reality had to be dismantled. The jungle, with its tangled undergrowth, ancient hardwoods, and chaotic biodiversity, was viewed not as an ecosystem to be managed, but as an obstacle to be removed. The primary weapon in this assault was fire. During the dry season, the sky over the concession turned a bruised, hazy orange. Crews of laborers, now numbering in the hundreds, moved through the designated sectors, slashing the underbrush and ringing the great trees, cutting deep into the cambium layers to kill them standing. Once the vegetation dried, the torches were applied. The resulting conflagration was visible for miles. It was a localized apocalypse that consumed centuries of botanical growth in a matter of hours. When the smoke cleared, the lush three-dimensional complexity of the rainforest was reduced to a blackened, two-dimensional plane of ash and stumps. Into this scorched void, the machinery of the Ford Motor Company advanced. The Lake Farge arrived with the heavy components of the sawmill, a massive industrial facility that would become the metabolic heart of the construction effort. The mill was not a temporary field station. It was a factory built to Detroit specifications. Huge steam boilers and steel blades were hauled up the riverbank and assembled on concrete foundations poured into the red earth. Once operational, the sawmill ran day and night. Its whistles dictated the rhythm of life in the settlement, replacing the natural cadence of sunrise and sunset. The sound of the saws, a high-pitched mechanical scream, echoed off the river, signaling to the surrounding forest that the era of silence was over. The trees that had been felled were stripped, planked, and cured to build the structures of the new town. The forest was literally being consumed to build its own replacement. As the land was cleared, the grid was imposed. This was the most visible manifestation of Henry Ford's ideology. In the chaotic sprawl of the Amazon, where tributaries shifted course and vegetation grew in wild fractals, the engineers laid out streets in perfect, rigid parallel lines. They built a modern power plant, a cathedral of brick and glass housing massive generators capable of electrifying a small city. For the first time in the history of the region, electric streetlights pushed back the equatorial darkness. They stood in stark rows, illuminating the red dust of the roads, glowing domes of civilization surrounded by a wall of impenetrable darkness. Simultaneously, the construction of the hospital began. This structure was designed to be the finest medical facility in the Amazon basin and arguably in all of South America. It was a necessity born of desperation. The clearing of the forest had disturbed the breeding grounds of mosquitoes, and malaria was tearing through the workforce. The hospital was a fortress of sanitation. It featured screened windows, modern surgical theaters, and a water filtration system. Its white walls stood out violently against the charred landscape. It was here that the secondary narrative of the settlement played out, the physical toll of the industrial assault on the human body. The labor force was a mix of local caboclos and migrants from the coast, enticed by the promise of wages that were double the regional average. However, the work demanded of them was grueling. They were not just clearing land, they were fighting a biological war. As they hacked away the jungle, they were exposed to swarms of insects, venomous snakes, and the crushing heat of the midday sun. The company's medical staff, led by doctors imported from the United States and Brazil, treated the workers not merely as patients, but as components of the machinery that required maintenance. Quinine was dispensed like oil for an engine. The health of the worker was prioritized only insofar as it ensured the continuity of the labor. The hospital logs from this period recorded a relentless stream of fevers, fractures, and infections, the human friction of the project's rapid acceleration. With the infrastructure rising, the agricultural phase commenced. This was the critical juncture where the Ford Way collided directly with botanical reality. In the wild, Hevea brasiliensis grows in isolation. A single rubber tree might be separated from its nearest neighbor by hundreds of yards of dense forest. This separation is a natural defense mechanism, a quarantine zone that prevents the spread of leaf blight and caterpillars. The Ford engineers, however, were not botanists. They were industrialists. They looked at the rubber tree and saw a unit of production, identical to a drill press or a lathe. Efficiency dictated density. In the newly established nurseries, workers were ordered to plant the seeds in tight, disciplined rows. The saplings grew shoulder to shoulder, a dense monoculture that mirrored the assembly lines of Highland Park. To the American managers, this looked like progress. It looked like farming. The neat, straight lines of young trees pleased the eye of men accustomed to order. They did not realize they were laying out a banquet for the natural predators of the rubber tree. By 1929, the silhouette of Fordlandia had emerged from the smoke. It was a surreal juxtaposition. On the banks of the Tapajos, a tributary of the wild Amazon, stood a replica of a Midwestern American town. There were rows of white bungalows for the workers, raised on stilts and covered with asbestos roofing. There were sidewalks made of cement. There was a deep-water dock where ships unloaded crates of frozen beef and canned goods from Dearborn. And towering over it all was the water tower, a steel structure painted with the Ford logo, visible for miles down the river. The climax of this construction phase was the completion of the American Zone, the neighborhood reserved for the white managers and their families. Here, the illusion of control was most complete. The houses were set on manicured lawns that required constant, exhausting labor to prevent the jungle from reclaiming them. The managers moved into these homes, bringing with them their victrolas, their linens, and their social customs. They held dinner parties behind screened porches, the electric fans spinning overhead to ward off the heat. Outside, beyond the circle of electric light, the jungle waited. The assault seemed successful. The chaos had been burned away. The grid had been laid. The trees were in the ground. The sawmill screamed its victory song every morning at 5 a.m. But the victory was purely architectural. The biological consequences of packing millions of trees into a confined space, and the social consequences of importing a rigid foreign culture, were beginning to germinate in the soil and in the minds of the workers. The system had been built, but it had not yet been tested. By 1930, the physical construction of Fordlandia was largely complete. The smoke from the initial clearing fires had dissipated, revealing a tableau that defied the logic of the Amazon basin. Viewed from the deck of a passing riverboat, the settlement appeared not as a frontier outpost, but as a hallucination. Here, 1,000 miles from the nearest paved metropolis, sat a precise replica of a Midwestern American suburb. The streets were lined with concrete sidewalks, illuminated by electric street lamps that buzzed in the twilight. There were rows of neat white bungalows with screened porches and manicured flower beds. There was a library stocked with the works of Emerson and Longfellow. There was a movie theater, a bakery, and a butcher shop. Most incongruously, amidst the towering mahogany and rubber trees, there were bright red fire hydrants. They stood at regular intervals along the paved streets, connected to a water system that mirrored the municipal codes of Detroit, waiting to extinguish fires in a rainforest that received nearly 100 inches of rain a year. This was the American Zone, a stage set constructed to perform the daily rituals of the United States. For the American managers and their families who had been transferred to Brazil, life in Fordlandia was an exercise in denial. They were tasked with maintaining the illusion that they were not in the jungle, but merely in a warmer extension of Michigan. The dress code was the primary instrument of this illusion. Despite the equatorial humidity that hovered near 100%, the managers were expected to dress for dinner. Men wore linen suits, ties, and stiff collars. Women wore long dresses and hosted tea parties on their verandas, serving canned peaches and imported biscuits on china plates. The labor required to maintain this facade was immense. In the damp heat, mold grew on leather shoes overnight. Pages of books fused together. The white linen suits required constant washing and starching to combat the inevitable sweat and red dust. Yet, the rituals persisted. The managers played tennis on concrete courts as macaws screamed from the canopy overhead. They organized reading groups to discuss American transcendentalist poetry, their voices competing with the drone of cicadas. Perhaps the most potent symbol of this surreal existence was the golf course. Henry Ford was not a golfer, but his executives were. To satisfy them, a 9-hole course was carved out of the jungle. It was a horticultural impossibility. The grasses of the Amazon grow with aggressive speed, capable of reclaiming a clearing in weeks. To maintain the fairways and greens, a dedicated crew of Brazilian laborers worked constantly with machetes and scythes, fighting a never-ending war against vegetation, so the Americans could put a white ball across the surface. The local workers, the caboclos, and the migrants from the coast watched this performance with a mixture of confusion and amusement. To them, the Americans were a strange tribe, obsessed with activities that served no survival purpose. They observed the foreigners sweating in their heavy clothes, eating food that came in tin cans rather than from the river, and hitting balls with metal sticks. The Americans seemed to be playing a game of civilization, acting out a script written by a man who had never seen the jungle. However, the script was not limited to the managers. Henry Ford's vision of the new messiah of industry required the cultural conversion of the workers as well. He did not just want their labor, he wanted their souls to be attuned to the rhythm of the machine age. This conversion took the form of mandatory, wholesome entertainment. Ford despised the jazz age, viewing the syncopated rhythms and loose morals of the Roaring Twenties as a corruption of American values. He believed in the purity of old-fashioned traditions. Consequently, Fordlandia was subjected to a regime of square dancing. On weekends, the workers were herded into the community hall. The local music, the samba, and the fluid, rhythmic songs of the river was silenced. In its place, fiddlers played "Turkey in the Straw" and other Anglo-Saxon folk tunes. The American managers, acting as instructors, attempted to teach the Brazilian laborers the rigid geometric movements of the square dance and the reel. The scene was theater of the absurd. Under the glare of electric lights, surrounded by the black wall of the jungle, men who had spent their lives navigating the currents of the Amazon were forced to link arms and do-si-do. The humidity turned the hall into a sauna. The steps were awkward, the rhythm foreign. The workers participated because their employment depended on it, but the joy was absent. It was a mechanical reenactment of happiness, engineered in Dearborn and assembled in Brazil. The cultural imposition extended to education. Schools were established for the children of the workers, where they were taught in English and learned to sing the Star-Spangled Banner. They studied the geography of the United States and the history of the Ford Motor Company. The curriculum was designed to produce not just rubber tappers, but future consumers, citizens of a Ford-centric world. Yet, beneath the surface of this ordered existence, the dissonance was deafening. The perfection of the town made the surrounding wilderness feel even more menacing. The electric lights did not push back the jungle. They merely attracted legions of insects. Moths the size of birds battered themselves against the screens of the managers' bungalows. Beetles short-circuited the generators. Snakes were frequently found curled on the manicured lawns of the golf course. The surreal dream of Fordlandia was a bubble. Inside, the phonographs played waltzes and the ice machine churned out cubes for lemonade. Outside, the biological reality of the Amazon waited. The town was beautiful in a sterile, eerie way, a place where the buildings were straight, the clothes were white, and the people were actors in a play that made no sense to the audience. The climactic moment of this surreal period occurred during a 4th of July celebration. The managers organized a parade. There were speeches about liberty and industry. An American flag was raised up a pole that had been shipped from Michigan. The workers stood in formation, listening to words they barely understood, sweltering in the sun. As the anthem played, a collective realization seemed to settle over the settlement. The Americans were not building a town for the future of Brazil. They were building a shrine to a memory of America. They were trying to stop time, to preserve a version of 19th century morality in a 20th century industrial camp. The disconnect was total. The managers believed they were bringing culture to the wilderness. The workers saw only a bizarre, expensive ritual. The American dream had arrived in the Amazon, but it had arrived as a caricature, a stiff, sweating figure in a linen suit, dancing a reel while the jungle watched in silence. If the square dances and reading groups of Fordlandia were the velvet glove of American civilization, the service department was the iron fist. By 1930, the settlement had ceased to be merely a peculiar experiment in transplantation. It had evolved into a panopticon. The Ford Motor Company did not believe that a worker's obligations ended when the whistle blew at 5 o'clock. In the philosophy of Dearborn, a man's private life was inextricably linked to his industrial output. To control production, one had to control the producer. The instrument of this control was a surveillance network that rivaled the company's operations in Michigan, yet felt infinitely more oppressive in the isolation of the Amazon. The service department, Ford's internal police force, patrolled the grid of streets. They were not looking for criminals in the traditional sense. They were looking for moral deviations. The primary target of this enforcement was alcohol. Although the sale and consumption of liquor were perfectly legal in Brazil, Henry Ford was a staunch prohibitionist. He viewed alcohol as a poison that corroded the efficiency of the worker and the stability of the family. Consequently, Fordlandia was declared a dry zone. This policy transformed the management of the town into a game of cat and mouse. The service department inspectors conducted random raids on the workers' bungalows. They searched beneath floorboards and inside cupboards for bottles of cachaça, the potent local sugarcane spirit. Workers returning from leave were subjected to physical searches at the docks. Any man found with alcohol, or even smelling of it, was subject to immediate termination. The imposition of American morality created a thriving shadow economy. Just beyond the jurisdiction of Ford's property, on a small river island, a settlement of shacks and bars sprang up. It was ironically named the Island of Innocence. Here, the vices banned in Fordlandia, liquor, gambling, and prostitution, flourished. The existence of the Island of Innocence underscored the failure of the moral blockade. On payday, boats would ferry workers across the water under the cover of darkness. They would trade their Ford wages for a few hours of autonomy, then return to the company town to sleep it off before the morning whistle. The company could police the town, but it could not police the river. However, the most intrusive aspect of the regime was not the prohibition of alcohol, but the regulation of the body itself through diet. Henry Ford held eccentric and rigid views on nutrition. He believed that the human body was a machine that required specific fuel to operate at peak efficiency. He distrusted animal proteins and spices, favoring a diet based on soy, wheat, and vegetables. In Michigan, this was a lifestyle choice. In the Amazon, it became a mandate. The company cafeteria, a massive structure designed to feed thousands, became the primary battleground of this biological conflict. The menu was dictated by Detroit. It featured oatmeal, whole wheat bread, canned peaches, and brown rice. For the Brazilian workers, this diet was not just unpalatable, it was culturally insulting and physically inadequate. Their traditional diet consisted of fish, manioc flour, beans, and meat. Foods adapted to the heavy caloric demands of labor in the tropics. The Ford diet was bland, heavy, and alien. The workers sat in the mess hall, sweating in the humid air, staring at bowls of hot oatmeal that had congealed in the heat. The refusal to serve fresh local food, which was abundant and cheap in favor of imported canned goods, was a constant reminder of their subjugation. It was a rejection of the Amazon itself. The company was effectively telling the workers that their culture, their land, and their sustenance were inferior to the industrial standard. Physical discomfort was compounded by the rigidity of the schedule. The Ford obsession with time, linear, segmented, and measurable, collided violently with the solar reality of the equator. In the Amazon, traditional labor followed the sun. Men worked in the cool of the early morning and the late afternoon, resting during the punishing heat of midday. This was a survival mechanism, a biological adaptation to the environment. Fordlandia ignored this. The plantation operated on a 9-to-5 schedule, identical to the shift patterns of the River Rouge plant. The whistle blew at mid-morning, signaling work to continue as the sun climbed to its zenith. The temperature in the fields often exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The time clock became the hated symbol of this oppression. Located at the entrance to the work sites, these mechanical sentinels required every worker to punch a card to prove their attendance. It was a ritual of distrust. The machine did not care about the weather or the exhaustion of the man. It cared only for the mark on the paper. Under this regime, the workers began to suffer. Heat exhaustion and dehydration were common. The clinic treated endless cases of digestive trouble, which the American doctors attributed to lack of hygiene rather than the forced dietary changes. The men were physically present, their hours logged on the cards, but their bodies were breaking down. A secondary narrative of resentment began to fester in the workers' quarters. It was a quiet, seething anger. The caboclos, who were accustomed to a life of relative independence, tapping rubber on their own terms, fishing when the river was high, hunting when the game was plentiful, found themselves reduced to numbered cogs. They were paid well, better than anyone else in the region, but the money was becoming less of a wage and more of a bribe to endure the humiliation. The tension was palpable in the dining hall. The clatter of spoons on metal trays was often the only sound, a sullen silence replacing the usual camaraderie of a meal. The American managers, eating in their own segregated dining room with white tablecloths, remained largely oblivious to the depth of this anger. They viewed the workers' sullenness as a lack of gratitude or a sign of laziness. They did not see it for what it was, the pressure building in a sealed vessel. The climax of this period of control came not with an explosion, but with a tightening of the screws. In late 1930, the company announced a new policy. To further align the plantation with the efficiency of Detroit, the waiters in the dining hall were to be replaced. The company decided to implement a service line system, a self-service cafeteria model. This seemingly minor administrative change was the final insult. In the local culture, the act of being served was a mark of dignity. To be forced to stand in line and accept a tray of unwanted food like prisoners or cattle stripped away, the last vestige of their status as free men. The system had sought to control their waking hours, their sleeping habits, their bloodstreams, and their stomachs. It had replaced the fluid time of the river with the mechanical time of the clock. It had replaced the community with the crowd. Fordlandia had succeeded in building a prison without walls, held together by the sheer force of money and ideology. But a prison built on the suppression of basic human needs, for autonomy, for respect, for culturally appropriate food, cannot stand indefinitely. The cultural prison was complete, but the inmates were no longer willing to serve their sentences. On December 20th, 1930, the humidity in the dining hall of Fordlandia was oppressive. It was the height of the rainy season, and the air hung heavy with the smell of damp earth and the bland, starchy odor of the company-mandated lunch. Hundreds of workers filed into the cafeteria, their clothes stained with the red dust of the plantation and the latex of the rubber trees. For months, the pressure had been building. The prohibition of alcohol, the dietary restrictions, the intrusion of inspectors into private homes, and the relentless ticking of the time clocks had created a volatile atmosphere. The workers, men who had been recruited from the fiercely independent river communities or the desperate slums of Belém, had reached their breaking point. The spark was trivial, as is often the case in systemic collapses. T. Ostenfeld, a Danish plantation manager known for his rigid adherence to Ford's policies, had recently implemented a new service system. To increase efficiency, the table service was abolished. Workers were now expected to line up with metal trays and serve themselves, a practice common in Detroit factories, but viewed here as a degrading reduction of status. As the line stalled, an argument broke out between a worker and a supervisor. Voices were raised. Ostenfeld intervened, attempting to assert the authority of the company. In that moment, the veneer of industrial discipline shattered. A metal tray was thrown. It struck the wall with a clang that silenced the room for a heartbeat, before the hall erupted into chaos. The riot that followed was not a random act of violence. It was a targeted dismantling of the symbols of control. The workers did not attack the jungle. They attacked the company. They smashed the electric lights that had banished the night. They overturned the trucks that carried them to the fields. Most significantly, they took sledgehammers to the time clocks, the mechanical eyes that had watched them for 2 years, smashing the gears and springs into the mud. The American managers, who had lived in the segregated American zone with their families, found themselves suddenly outnumbered and defenseless. The authority they wielded was based on the presumption of order, and without that order, they were merely foreigners in a hostile land. Terrified, the management staff fled. They abandoned their white bungalows, their radios, and their starched linens. In a supreme irony, the men who had come to civilize the jungle were forced to hide in it. Some commandeered small boats and retreated to the center of the Tapajos River, drifting in the current, watching as plumes of smoke rose from the settlement. Others fled into the forest, spending the night shivering in the undergrowth, listening to the sounds of their town being dismantled. For 2 days, Fordlandia belonged to the workers. They broke into the warehouses and liberated the stockpiles of food. They destroyed the records office, erasing the debt logs and the employment files. The whistle at the sawmill fell silent. The cultural prison had been breached. Order was only restored with the arrival of the Brazilian military, Pan American Airways pilots, flying overhead, had reported the disturbance, and the request for intervention was dispatched. Soldiers arrived by riverboat, and the rebellion was quelled not by management, but by force. The ringleaders were arrested, and the workers returned to the lines, their wages docked to pay for the damages. To Henry Ford in Michigan, the riot was a baffling personnel issue. He attributed it to agitators and communist influence, refusing to acknowledge the cultural suffocation his policies had engineered. He ordered the town rebuilt. The clocks were replaced. The whistles blew again. However, while the company focused on repairing the sociological damage, a far more lethal enemy was mobilizing in the silence of the groves. The riot had been a human reaction to an artificial environment. The second rebellion was biological, and it was a direct consequence of the agricultural decisions made in Chapter 3. By 1931, the rubber trees planted in the early days of the project had begun to mature. They stood in vast, disciplined phalanxes, millions of them, their branches touching, forming a continuous canopy of green. In the wild Amazon, Hevea brasiliensis is a solitary creature. A single tree might be separated from its kin by half a mile of dense, diverse vegetation. This isolation is its evolutionary defense against pests and pathogens. Fordlandia had removed this defense. By planting the trees in high-density monocultures, the engineers had created an all-you-can-eat buffet for the South American leaf blight, Microcyclus uli. The blight began microscopically. Spores, carried by the wind from the surrounding jungle, landed on the leaves of the plantation trees. In a natural setting, a spore might find one tree and kill a few leaves, but it would struggle to find another host before dying. Here, the spore simply had to drift a few feet to find the next victim. The spread was exponential. The first sign was a darkening of the leaves. They turned a sickly gray, then black, shriveling as the fungus consumed the cellular structure. Then, they fell. A rubber tree relies on its leaves to photosynthesize the energy required to produce latex. When it loses its leaves, it goes into shock. It draws upon its sugar reserves to push out a second flush of foliage. But the blight was waiting. The new, tender leaves were even more susceptible to the fungus. The trees were caught in a death spiral of defoliation and regrowth, exhausting their energy reserves until the branches began to die back, turning brittle and gray. As if the fungus were not enough, the insect world responded to the concentration of food. Lacebugs and caterpillars descended on the weakened trees. The silence of the plantation was replaced by the sound of millions of mandibles chewing. The canopy, which should have been a vibrant, sun-blocking green, turned into a skeletal network of bare branches baking in the sun. The American managers were baffled. They applied fungicides, but the rains washed the chemicals away as fast as they could be sprayed. They tried to prune the trees, but the spores were airborne, invisible, and ubiquitous. The duality of the collapse was now complete. The riot had proven that the American social system could not be imposed on the Amazonian worker without force. The blight proved that the American industrial system could not be imposed on the Amazonian ecology at all. The factory model, which relied on uniformity, proximity, and scale, was the very thing killing the plantation. In Detroit, putting machines close together increased efficiency. In the Amazon, putting trees close together ensured death. By the mid-1930s, Fordlandia was a broken engine. The hospital was still the best in the region, the power plant still hummed, and the golf course was still mowed. But the reason for it all, the rubber, was dead. The trees stood in their perfect rows like tombstones in a military cemetery. The Ford way had collided with the fundamental laws of biology, and biology had won. The illusion of control, so carefully maintained by white fences and time clocks, had dissolved into the humid air. The jungle had not been conquered. It had simply waited for the invaders to make a mistake, and then it had devoured them. By the late 1930s, the Fordlandia experiment had entered a phase of terminal decline, though the machinery of the Ford Motor Company refused to acknowledge it. The disaster of the leaf blight and the social unrest of the riots had proven that the original site was untenable. Yet, the corporate organism in Dearborn possessed a stubborn momentum. Rather than admitting defeat, the company attempted a tactical retreat. They moved operations 30 miles downriver to a new location called Belterra. Belterra was meant to be the correction of the original error. The land was flat, not hilly. The soil was richer. The wind patterns were different. In the minds of the managers, these variables would solve the equation. They cleared the land again. They built a new model town, complete with a new hospital, new schools, and new rows of neat white bungalows. They planted millions of new trees, this time using high-yield clones grafted onto resistant rootstock. But the fundamental philosophy remained unchanged. They were still attempting to impose a monoculture on the Amazon. They were still lining up identical biological units in vast, unbroken grids. The South American leaf blight, indifferent to the change in zip code, followed them down the river. The spores drifted on the wind, finding the new plantation just as easily as they had found the old one. The trees at Belterra sickened and died, with the same predictable regularity as those at Fordlandia. While this slow-motion agricultural tragedy played out in Brazil, the world stage was shifting violently. The outbreak of World War II in 1939 briefly injected a new, desperate urgency into the project. The Japanese military seized the rubber plantations of Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, cutting off 90% of the world's rubber supply. Suddenly, the Allied war machine was starving for tires. Washington looked to the Amazon. For a brief moment, Fordlandia and Belterra were not just eccentric money pits, they were potential strategic assets. The U.S. government poured money into the region, hoping to revitalize the wild rubber trade. But biology does not respect geopolitical necessity. The trees could not be hurried. They continued to wither. Ultimately, it was not the jungle that killed the project, but the laboratory. Pressed by the wartime shortage, American scientists achieved the breakthrough that Henry Ford had sought in agriculture, the mass production of synthetic rubber. By 1944, factories in the United States were churning out petroleum-based rubber that was cheaper, more durable, and entirely independent of the Amazonian climate. The strategic justification for Fordlandia evaporated overnight. In Dearborn, the architect of the dream was fading. Henry Ford, now in his 80s, had suffered a series of strokes. The titan who had once micromanaged the placement of every machine in his factories was now a shadow, drifting through the halls of his estate, disconnected from the empire he had built. He had spent millions of dollars, estimates range from $20 million to $500 million in today's currency, on his Amazonian utopia. He had received daily reports, weather logs, and production schedules for nearly 2 decades. Yet, in a final quiet tragedy, Henry Ford never visited Fordlandia. He never saw the white bungalows, never heard the whistle of the sawmill, and never stood beneath the water tower that bore his name. The project remained for him an abstraction, a perfect city on a map that existed only in his mind, uncorrupted by the messy reality of the mud and the blight. On April 7, 1947, Henry Ford died by candlelight during a power outage at his estate in Dearborn. With his death, the emotional tether holding the company to the Amazon was severed. Control of the Ford Motor Company passed to his grandson, Henry Ford II. The Deuce, as he was known, was a man of a different era. He was not a visionary social engineer. He was a pragmatic industrialist tasked with saving a company that was, by then, losing millions of dollars a month due to chaotic management. He brought in a team of cold-eyed accountants known as the Whiz Kids to audit the empire. When they looked at the ledgers for the Amazon division, they saw no romance. They saw only a hemorrhage of capital. The rubber produced at Fordlandia had cost the company significantly more per pound than if they had simply bought it on the open market, even at monopoly prices. The schools, the hospitals, the golf courses, the square dances, items that the elder Ford viewed as essential investments in humanity, were categorized by the new management as wasteful overhead. The decision was swift and unsentimental. There would be no more subsidies, no more ships carrying canned peaches and linen suits. The order was given to liquidate the asset. In 1945, negotiations were opened with the Brazilian government. The terms were humiliating. The Ford Motor Company agreed to sell the entire concession, the 2 towns, the power plants, the hospitals, the docks, the water systems, and the millions of dead or dying trees, for a nominal sum of $244,000. It was a fraction of the investment. It was less a sale than a disposal. The evacuation began. The secondary narrative of the collapse focused on the residents who were being left behind. For nearly 20 years, a generation of caboclos and local workers had adapted to the Ford system. They had grown accustomed to the medical care, the electric lights, and the steady wages. They had learned to live by the clock. Now, the clock was stopping. The American managers packed their belongings with hurried efficiency. The contents of the houses, the Victrolas, the refrigerators, the golf clubs, were crated up and loaded onto the barges. The hospital equipment, the most advanced in the Amazon, was stripped. On the final day, the mood on the docks was not one of anger, but of bewildered silence. The locals watched as the last boat, carrying the last administrators, pulled away from the pier. The American flag was lowered from the pole in the town square. The Brazilian flag was raised, but it flew over a ghost town. The transition was abrupt. One evening, the streetlights of Fordlandia hummed with electricity generated by the massive diesel engines. The next, the fuel ran out, and the darkness of the rainforest rushed back in to reclaim the streets. The silence that followed was profound. The scream of the sawmill, which had defined the sonic landscape for a generation, was gone. Nature, which had been held at bay by the constant application of labor and chemistry, began its counterattack immediately. Without the crews of men with machetes to beat it back, the jungle advanced. Vines crept over the manicured lawns of the American zone, moving with a speed that seemed almost predatory. They curled around the white picket fences and forced their way through the screens of the porches. Termites, the true owners of the Amazon, turned their attention to the structures. They ate through the wooden steps of the bungalows. They consumed the dance floor where the workers had once been forced to square dance. They built their earthen cathedrals on the rotting desks of the administration building. The metal machinery fared no better. In the extreme humidity, rust is a living thing. The massive steam engines, the tractors that had tipped over in the mud, and the water pumps seized up. Their iron skins turned a deep, flaking orange, blending eventually with the color of the earth itself. The water tower, the highest point in the settlement, remained standing. The paint peeled away in long strips under the equatorial sun. The blue and white logo of the Ford Motor Company faded, bleaching into anonymity. The collapse of Fordlandia was not a bang, but a slow, suffocating embrace. The system simply ceased to exist. The rigid lines of the grid were blurred by the chaotic growth of the forest. The attempt to impose a straight line on a curved world had failed. The Americans had gone, taking their geometry with them, and the Amazon began the long, slow work of digestion. 80 years after the last American manager boarded a steamer for Michigan, the silence of Fordlandia is no longer the silence of abandonment. It is the heavy, breathing silence of the Amazon, punctuated by the sounds of a community that has learned to live in the wreckage of a dream. Today, the journey to Fordlandia remains difficult. The river is still the only reliable highway. When the modern traveler arrives, the first thing visible above the canopy is still the water tower. It rises 150 feet into the air, a steel sentinel rusting in the equatorial sun. The Ford logo, once painted in proud blue and white, has long since faded, scoured away by decades of rain. Yet the structure stands, a stubborn monument to an industrial ambition that refused to bend to the reality of the terrain. Below the tower, the grid remains. The straight streets laid out by Detroit engineers have not completely disappeared, though they are cracked and encroached upon by grass. The red fire hydrants are still there, standing like cryptic totems in the tall weeds, unconnected to any water source, guarding houses that no longer fear fire as much as they fear rot. The American zone, once the exclusive enclave of the white management, has been repurposed. The bungalows, with their steep roofs designed to shed Michigan snow rather than vent Amazonian heat, are now inhabited by local Brazilian families. These residents are squatters in the eyes of history, but rightful heirs in the eyes of survival. They have modified the structures, stripping away the screens to allow the breeze to enter, hanging hammocks on the porches where tea parties were once held. The hospital, once the pride of the settlement and the most advanced medical facility in South America, is a concrete shell. Its windows are gone, leaving gaping black eyes in the white facade. Inside, the surgical suites where American doctors once waged war against malaria are empty, home now to bats and creeping vines. The tile floors, scrubbed daily with disinfectant in 1930, are covered in a layer of red dust and guano. This physical decay serves as the text for the final lesson of the Fordlandia experiment. It is a lesson not about economics, but about the fundamental incompatibility of the industrial mindset with the biological world. Henry Ford's error was not a lack of capital. He spent the modern equivalent of nearly $500 million. It was not a lack of organization. The logistical chain from Dearborn to the Tapajos was a marvel of efficiency. The error was a category mistake. Ford believed that nature was merely a disorganized factory. He believed that with enough bulldozers and enough geometry, he could impose the logic of the assembly line onto the chaotic web of a rainforest ecosystem. The rows of dead rubber trees, long since consumed by the jungle, proved that biology does not obey the laws of manufacturing. A machine part is static. It does not change unless acted upon. A biological organism is dynamic. It evolves, reacts, and defends itself. By planting trees in dense monocultures, Ford created the perfect incubator for the blight that destroyed them. He attempted to standardize a living system, and the system responded with a plague. Furthermore, the social failure of Fordlandia offers a stark critique of industrial paternalism. The belief that a specific set of cultural values, Midwestern, Protestant, teetotaling, and timed by a clock, could be exported and installed like software was an act of profound arrogance. The managers viewed the local culture not as a different way of being, but as a void to be filled with American virtues. The island of innocence, the riots, and the eventual abandonment demonstrate that human communities, like forests, cannot be engineered from the top down. Loyalty cannot be manufactured on a production line. The workers took the wages because they were hungry, but they rejected the culture because it denied their humanity. They were treated as components of a machine, and like the rubber trees, they refused to thrive in captivity. In the present day, Fordlandia exists in a state of suspended animation. It has become a destination for a specific kind of tourism, people drawn to the aesthetics of failure. They walk the overgrown golf course, where the jungle has reclaimed the fairways, leaving only the vague outline of the hazards. They stand in the ruined sawmill, looking at the massive gears that once screamed with the sound of progress, now silent and cold. For the 2,000 people who currently live in the vicinity, the ruins are not a tragedy, but a resource. They have dismantled the warehouses for scrap metal. They have used the bricks from the power plant to build new additions to their homes. In a final irony, the efficiency of Ford's materials has allowed the local population to survive long after the company's ideology perished. The climactic image of Fordlandia is found in the warehouse district. Here, vast stocks of equipment were left behind in 1945. There are trucks stamped with the Ford script that have been swallowed by fig trees, the roots wrapping around the axles and crushing the chassis. The metal has not just rusted, it has been metabolized by the forest. This fusion of machine and nature is the true legacy of the project. It is a visual testament to the fact that the earth ultimately wins every argument. The jungle did not fight Fordlandia with weapons or policy. It simply waited. It waited for the money to run out, for the enthusiasm to wane, and for the managers to grow old. Then it moved back in. Henry Ford wanted to build a garden in the wilderness. Instead, he built a ruin that serves as a warning. It stands as a reminder that while technology can conquer distance and capital can conquer markets, neither can conquer the complex, indifferent mechanics of life itself. The Ford way ended where the jungle began. Henry Ford spent his entire life perfecting the assembly line, but in the end, he learned the hardest lesson of all from the jungle. Life cannot be manufactured. Fordlandia stands today not just as a failed business venture, but as a silent monument to the things that money cannot buy and engineering cannot control. Now, I turn the question to you. Do you see Ford's ambition as a visionary dream that was simply ahead of its time? Or was it the blind arrogance of a man who thought he was bigger than nature? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read them all, and I am curious to hear your perspective on this strange chapter of history. If you found this journey into the lost empire of the Amazon fascinating, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Join me next time as we uncover another story of ambition, rise, and fall. Thank you for watching.